today, I want to get kind of to the roots of DBT. We were discussing kind of just starting at the beginning. So, if we could, in your best abilities, can you explain to us, who is Marsha Linehan, who I think is the inventor of DBT? Who is she, and what made her create DBT?
Yeah, so first of all, DBT or dialectical behavior therapy is it's a program that, as you say, was created by Marsha Linehan, Dr. Marsha Linehan, as she is now, or has been for a while. She is somebody who, throughout her childhood, experienced a lot of mental health issues, ended up being diagnosed with schizophrenia when she was a teenager, went into a residential treatment program, during which time she, I believe it was in a hospital, she realized that, maybe she didn't have schizophrenia herself, but there was a lot of, emotional problems that she couldn't handle it when she was feeling things and all over the place. And eventually left residential treatment when she was 18. Well, feeling, first of all, when she's in that residential treatment, she's feeling like it's substandard treatment. It's not what she's looking for. She's not getting the kind of support that she thinks is necessary for her to get better, to get well. Eventually leaves residential treatment when she's about 18, I believe, with the diagnosis of borderline personality disorder. So, as a result of going through that process of being involved in the residential treatment and the kind of stuff that she was exposed to, decided that it was going to become her life goal, if you like, or a life purpose to basically research and create a treatment that was designed to support people that were emotionally dysregulated in the way that she was. So she went about basically doing the research, obviously getting her PhD in psychology, and doing the research around emotional dysregulation, and really looking at all of the evidence-based processes or treatments that people were using back in those days, not just from a psychology perspective, but just a well-rounded perspective, looking at the way that people are living their lives. One of the things that she talks about is that evidence-based treatment is super, super important when it comes to doing this type of work, because when something is considered to be evidence-based, it means that there's been an absolutely ton of research that's done around the recreation of the success. So, a lot of treatments can be, under certain circumstances, can be seen as successful one time. Okay. Then when you go to try to recreate it, it's like when you do any kind of research around uh, any medical situation, any psychological situation. You can, if you gear the research up the right way, you can make it successful one time. When things become evidence based is when they are repeatable. So I think the standard is 3 or 5 times it has to be repeatable in a row. So that when the research is done with given certain parameters, it's shown to be effective. That's the key component to it, right? Is that the research that's done shows that the treatment that we're doing for this particular set of behavioral issues is effective multiple times in a row, to show that it is something that's going to help people when they start to do it. So DBT, first of all, dialectical behavior therapy, is an evidence-based, so there's tons of research into supporting people with emotional dysregulation. So Marsha Linehan herself was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, and is somebody, if you look at all of the interviews that she does, a lot of the stuff on YouTube that's out there with Marsha Linehan herself talking, doesn't necessarily agree with the diagnosis of borderline personality disorder. She considers herself to be a behaviorist, as do I, which means that labeling people with diagnosis is not necessarily our thing. It's not necessarily my thing. It's when you look at something called the DSM, which is where all the list of mental health and addiction issues are when people are being diagnosed with these things by psychiatrists. Basically, that's just a list of behaviors that people line up with. to get this particular diagnosis. And the reason that that's there then is because then that means that there's a treatment we can provide that's had research that's done into how effective that treatment is. It's the whole purpose of the DSM, basically. So, borderline personality disorder was what DBT was originally developed for, particularly for people who are dealing with a lot of emotional dysregulation and a lot of suicidal thoughts. So, as a result of all of the research and all of the stuff that she did herself, she went out and looked at all of these evidence-based treatments, and she started to put together a whole bunch of skills that became known as the DBT skills program, skills training program. So in DBT, she researched cognitive therapy, she researched mindfulness, she would put herself into lots of different mindful programs through like religious organizations. She was in a monastery, she researched Catholicism, Buddhism, what prayer looks like. She put herself through all sorts of different meditation programs, trying to find what was effective to work with the sort of emotional dysregulation that she was dealing with and the clients that she was researching were dealing with, until she came up with these different skills that were effective to treat the kind of stuff that she was doing the research on. So she's somebody who campaigns for borderline personality disorder to be the diagnosis of borderline personality disorder to be changed. There's a whole bunch of stuff out there about her talking about how she wanted it to be changed to emotional dysregulation disorder, I believe. I could be wrong on the language, but basically around emotional dysregulation, because people who are going to benefit from the skills of dialectical behavior therapy are people who will identify in some way as being on the continuum of emotional sensitivity. So people who are impacted by their emotions in a way that can dysregulate their system. And people who, as a result of that emotional dysregulation and that emotional sensitivity, probably grew up in environments that are considered to be emotionally invalidating. So what that means is that if you are somebody who identifies as being on the continuum of emotional sensitivity, I do, and you grew up in an environment where you felt like your emotional reactions in the environment were invalidated. So, that can be a number of different things. You can be told, suck it up, buttercup. You can be told, boys don't cry. You can be told, what have you got to be sad about? You can just be ignored when you're experiencing emotions and you're trying to put them out there into the environment. Like lots of different ways that our emotions can be invalidated, and not necessarily deliberately. Most of the time it's not deliberate. Most of the time it's just the person trying to cope with their own emotions in the environment in the only way they know how. So people who fall on the continuum of emotional sensitivity, feeling like they grew up in an emotionally invalidating environment, don't learn how to regulate their emotions as a result of that. So how that presents then is every time we experience an emotion, our system goes into automatic coping mechanisms, trying to shut down the emotional experience, get people to listen to us in learned behavioral ways. So usually we go into a state of fear, some kind of fight or flight. And the thing about having our emotions invalidated is that as soon as we feel invalidated in the environment, it just ramps up the need for validation. So, when I'm experiencing emotions, there's three different things that emotions are supposed to do for us. So primarily, dialectical behavior therapy is an emotion focused therapy. It's all about learning how to understand what emotions we're experiencing, what they feel like when they send our system into a state of distress, how to regulate that distress so that we don't make the situations worse, and then how to change the emotional responses that we have by removing the rigidity that's tied to the particular behavioral response that we've got. And then how to communicate with other people what it is that we want and what it is that we need to build the kind of relationships that we're looking for. So these are all put together into a whole bunch of skills. But first and foremost, what we need to learn is that we are emotional people. We are probably fall somewhere on the emotional continuum of sensitivity, and we grew up in an emotionally invalidating environment, or we felt like we grew up in an emotionally invalidating environment. So all emotions, every single emotion that we experience basically does three things. First thing it does is whenever that emotion comes into our system, is it sends a signal through our body language, through our behaviors, through what we're putting out into the environment. It sends a signal out to the people around us that something's going on. Second thing it does is it activates. It's letting us know when we notice there is an emotional experience that we're having, that there's something that we need to pay attention to. So there's something going on that we need to pay attention to. And then the third thing it does is it activates a behavioral response. So learning this about our emotions is kind of the fundamental starting place for DBT, where we need to recognize that we are emotionally sensitive people. If we identify with that, that's great. If we understand that the reason we get emotionally dysregulated is because we feel invalidated about those emotional experiences, and we're reacting to the fact that when we were children, we didn't feel like those emotions were validated in the environment around us, so we didn't learn how to cope with those emotions in a healthy way. And that we have these automatic behavioral responses that are kicking in as a result of those emotions, and we need to learn how to change the rigidity that we have to those emotional responses. So first things first, it's about recognizing those three things. Then as a result of that, there are skills that we bring together, starting with mindfulness, going into distress tolerance, emotion regulation, and interpersonal effectiveness. So communicating what we want and we need with other people, that we build from. So we learn all these different skills purely and simply because we didn't learn how to do these things when we were children. We didn't learn how to regulate our emotions when we were children. So we basically got to re-educate these parts of our personality. If we're talking about integration with schema therapy, we basically got to re-educate our system how to deal with these things. Does that make sense?
It does. One that you left out that I'd like to explore is self-analysis. First of all, what is self-analysis and how important is it if we're going to do the exploration of DBT?
Yeah, so ultimately what we want to be able to do when we're doing this work is to analyze, is to recognize what's going on in our system ourselves, so that we can change the way that we're responding to things without the need for somebody else to constantly do it for us. So self-analysis is basically just self reflecting on what it is that's happened for us, and learning how to recognize the things that are coming into our system when after the fact, first of all, so that we can start to see the things that we need to practice in order to make the changes that we need to make. So just because we suddenly know that, for me, just because I suddenly know that I'm an emotionally sensitive person, I fall on the continuum of emotional sensitivity. So what I mean by that is our emotional sensitivity isn't black and white. It's not on or off. It's not, it's not suddenly I'm emotionally sensitive or suddenly I'm not. It's on a continuum. So most people who deal with DBT, who are going to find the skills of DBT effective, are going to fall somewhere on the continuum of emotional sensitivity. So, recognizing that we are emotionally sensitive people, just because all of a sudden I recognized that I was an emotionally sensitive person, didn't mean that, I was suddenly going to be able to change everything. That's not a realistic expectation. It's going to take time and work to actually change these things. So, DBT itself is not a quick fix. I need to be really clear about that. It takes a lot of work and a lot of effort. It's it's a lifestyle more than anything that we're trying to create. We're trying to learn how to live the life we want to live, being the person that we want to be, in the areas of life that are important to us. So really focusing on who we want to be and how we want to be known in the environment, how we want to treat other people and how we want other people to treat us. So just because we learn that we're emotionally sensitive people doesn't mean that that's suddenly going to change. So in the beginning, we're going to focus a lot on developing our ability to self-analyze. So when we're trying to live the life we want to live and be the person that we want to be, by putting things in place where, we're building a foundation in, as we've talked about in other videos, we're building a foundation that's got a lot of routine and structure in it. We're trying to make sure that we're living the life we want to live, doing things that are important to us, being the person that we want to be. And stuff's going to happen that's going to activate our emotions. So when our emotions get activated, we're going to react because we're going to go into a state of being that has an automatic reaction that's connected to the emotion that we're experiencing. A lot of the time, this gets referred to as being in a state of fight or flight. So, there's an emotional reaction in our system, and we're going to do something. That's just a given. Okay, we're going to react in a way. Emotional distress is going to cause us to do something. So we need to be able to recognize that we've just participated in a behavioral response that we didn't really want to participate in, and build our ability to self-analyze around what it is that we want to do about that, so that we can then practice the skills we need to practice to change that emotional reaction. Because whenever we get emotionally activated, we just go into automatic behavioral responses.
Hold on, can I
It's,
ask you, Stephen, just to
yeah,
clarify something, because something that's confusing me a little is when you say we're trying to work with the emotional reaction and then you're separating that from the behavioral reaction, can you define the difference in the two?
there is no difference. The emotional
Okay.
reaction is the behavioral response.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. So, there's an emotional reaction in my system which activates a behavioral response. So, the emotional
Gotcha.
reaction is I feel this, or there's a part of me that is feeling this, which automatically activates a behavioral response in our system. So, the part of me goes, I'm feeling this. This is what I need to do.
Gotcha.
Right? I'm afraid that if this keeps going the way that it is, it's going to cause me to feel guilt and shame. I don't want to feel guilt and shame. And it happens like that. It's not like we're
I
processing it
hear
like
you.
this. I'm afraid that if this situation plays out the way that it is, it's going to make me feel guilt and shame. I don't know how to cope with guilt and shame. So the fear that's in my system activates a behavioral response. And that behavioral response is either going to be fight. I'm going to get angry and confrontational with everybody that's in the environment with me. It's going to be flight. I'm going to run away. I'm going to avoid. I'm not going to go and connect with these people. It's going to be freeze. I'm not going to do anything. I'm just going to stop and hope that this passes me by. It's going to be submit. So I'm going to give in to whatever it is that's going on around me, what I'm being told, either internally or externally, or it's going to be distract. So I'm just going to, ooh, shiny thing.
Can I just say to the distract one, as you were saying that, I was thinking of the last awkward moment where I went right into my phone.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It was like, okay, this is happening around and pretend like I'm texting someone right now.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Right. Distract myself from what's going on in the environment. Right. So whenever there is an emotional response in our system, whenever there's an emotion that gets activated in our system, there is an automatic behavioral response that's going to kick in. We have to learn how to recognize these behavioral responses to figure out whether they are effective or ineffective for us to be the person that we want to be. It is not about these behavioral responses being good, bad, right, wrong. It's about these behavioral responses being effective or ineffective for us to be the person that we want to be. The term dialectical is all about understanding that there are multiple ways to look at any given situation. It's basically what it means. So, very little in life is black and white. I used to say nothing in life is black and white, but that in itself is a black and white statement. So, very little in life is black and white. There are some things that are black and white. What we're trying to do is find out when we have a perspective on a particular situation and a behavioral response kicks in, is that behavioral response and therefore that perspective effective for us to live the life we want to live and be the person that we want to be? If it's effective, if it's helpful for me to be the person that I want to be, don't worry about it. Leave it as it is. Keep doing it. Because if it's effective for you to be the person that you want to be, then why would we need to change it? Most of the time, though, our behavioral responses in any given situation is not effective for us to be the person that we want to be. Usually it's maladaptive and ineffective. So things like, excessive anger, lashing out at the people around us, substance use, process addictions, issues with food, sex, gambling,
ADHD.
ADHD, yeah, distraction, like all those sorts of things, right? So these are just behavioral responses to the emotional experience that we're having. So first of all, we have to learn how to recognize that these are behavioral responses. And that means self-analysis. It means reflecting on what's happened, contemplating the different things that we've gone through on a daily basis, and looking at our behavioral responses and going, oh, that's interesting. How do what could I have done differently there? Did that go well for me? Just reflecting on what's happening during the day so that we can see, is there something that we're doing in the build up to our, every single day that's going to be that's causing us to have these emotional reactions. And if everything's in place for us to live the life we want to live and be the person that we want to be, and we're still having these emotional reactions, what are the skills that are missing? So in DBT, this is called the self-analysis process, and it is, really, really important for us to know how to do this with the understanding that we don't have the skills in place yet. So in the beginning, what we're trying to do is just start the self-reflection process without the expectation that we're going to fix everything right away. So one of the biggest issues that people experience when they come into any kind of DBT work is this kind of black and white rigidity around, well, now I know it, I should be able to fix it. And we're going to get into the difference between knowing and feeling when we start talking about the mindfulness aspect. But I wanted to start off today by just talking about, and you bringing it up as well, just talking about the self-analysis point, because without the ability to self-analyze, we're constantly relying on other people to tell us what to do, to tell us what it is that we need to change. And it's not effective for any kind of long-term sustainable solutions to the issues that we're experiencing. Ultimately, we have to learn how to self-analyze. Otherwise, we're constantly reacting and then looking at other people to tell us what to do differently. So,
Well, sorry, I just want to say something because for me, I've been coming to your groups for a little while now, and something that I found in my own exploration when you talk about getting to know the tools and wanting to do the work real quick was when you would talk to us about and I know I'm jumping into schema, I think with this language, but the inner critic,
yeah,
you would ask us to listen to the voice and recognize what kind of voice is it, what language is it using, is it your mom, is it your dad, is it maybe friends? And for me, I understood what you were saying, but to me, it was just my thoughts. I didn't
yeah,
understand the voices or the language. It's only now that I can go, oh, there's my dad. Like I actually can hear the
yeah,
voice, and it's because of my own self exploration, not Stephen, what do I do next? And there is still this eagerness that it's like I'm ready to go, and it's like, okay, here, try it, but I don't know if it's as effective as it may be for me in maybe 3 or 4 more years when it comes to this exploration of constant practice. So I really like what you're saying here about the self-analysis thing and that it isn't an instantaneous thing.
no,
For me, it's been at least a couple of years, and I think I'm just hitting on the brink of really separating myself from my thoughts and hearing them as different,
yeah,
tones and
yeah.
voices, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. So in the work that I do, as anybody that's attended the groups or looked around the YouTube channel and the website that I've got, I integrate the skills of dialectical behavior therapy with the theories of schema therapy. So both of which are evidence-based treatments. So they've both been researched and researched and researched to show that they're effective to support people in the things that they're trying to do. And when you integrate the two together, there's such a connection between the way that we look at things. And obviously, we're going to talk more about that when we get into the skills. Connecting the different behavioral responses that we have to the parts of our personality that are falling into these modes of behavior, understanding that these things, when we're checking the facts and stuff like that, are coming from particular schemas that have been activated throughout our childhood years. So when we get into the other skills, we'll start to link the language of DBT and schema therapy together. But like you're saying, the most important, well, not most important, one of the really important things for us to understand is developing our ability to self-analyze. Just because we've had a behavioral response, and this is super key in the language, okay? Just because we've had a behavioral reaction to a particular situation doesn't mean that that behavioral reaction is bad, doesn't mean that that behavioral reaction is wrong. The question that we're trying to figure out is it effective for us to be the person that we want to be? Does it help us to be the person in the environment that we want to be, to treat people the way that we want to treat them, to be treated the way that we want to be treated? Is it effective for us to have this behavioral response? So first of all, we've got to know what that behavioral response is. So, without the ability to self-reflect and self-analyze, we're not going to see those behavioral responses. So,
Can I ask you one, Stephen, just to explore it?
Yeah,
is because I think it's a great three branch question when you're talking about not just the effectiveness of the outcome, but who do I want to be? Who does this,
yeah.
how do I want to be received by people? How do I want to be received by myself? Let's think of a bully. Let's think of a person who's got an aggressive personality and it's working. I throw my weight around, I push my weight, and I get what I want. Why should I change? And then you ask the question of, is this effective to be who you want to be? Well, I'm getting what I want. Do you have everything you want? Are you happy? Well, no, I'm a little lonely.
Well,
I'm
is what you've got how you want to be? So, you can talk about it from the perspective of substance use.
sure.
A person who uses substances, the use of that particular substance is incredibly effective to get what I want in the moment. And this is the problem with instant gratification, right? In the moment, the behavioral response that we have in the short term is going to be effective. So whether you're talking about the bully, whether you're talking about somebody who uses substances to cope or processes to cope, which bullying is a process, but whichever behavioral responses that we're using, it's going to be effective in the short term. We have to acknowledge that right off the bat. Okay, and this is when we go back to the problem with instant gratification. So um, instantly rewarding behavioral responses are usually ineffective for us to live the life we want to live and be the person we want to be in the bigger picture. Not always. Sometimes an instantly rewarding behavioral response is an effective thing for me to do. So, for example, if I'm in a dangerous situation and the short-term effective response to me right now is to get angry at the people around me, to push them away from me because I need to confront this situation and push them away. That's an instantly rewarding behavioral response to a situation that is completely effective for me to keep myself safe, live the life I want to live, and be the person that I want to be. What we're looking at, though, in the bigger picture is if we're constantly using that behavioral response with a rigid perspective that it's the only thing I can do when I feel the way that I feel, it's usually ineffective for us to live the life we want to live and be the person that we want to be in the areas of life that are important to us, because it impacts other people and impacts ourselves in a way that just keeps those maladaptive behaviors going and causes us to stay stuck in particular emotional experiences. It's a shitload of information that I just threw at you.
No, but it's a lot. Here's the thing about it, Stephen, is I love it, first of all, but I think a lot of it comes like the term self-analysis, not others' diagnosis.
Yeah.
And it's easy for me to point, I know I'm guilty of this, to point at other people who are behaving in that way and saying, you need to get yourself some help. When in actuality, it's my experience of their behavior that's causing me to
Yeah.
think they need to get help. But it's what can I do for myself to help myself with that type of thinking?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, and I love that, like you're saying, it's the first it takes the wanting and the willingness, the recognition that there is parts of my personality that I'd like to work with. And then the acceptance that they aren't wrong or flawed. They're just doing things in an ineffective, the language you're using, an ineffective response for me to be the person I want to be. So being able to have that kind conversation, I guess, with myself and
Passion. Yeah.
yeah, compassionate conversation, and for lack of a better terms, try to reparent myself. It's okay, and change my language. Go ahead, Stephen. Why don't you like that language?
Yeah. I'm a little bit cautious of reparenting um, because I prefer to kind of shift that language into re-educating. Um, Parenting, using that type of language can lead to some pretty rigid emotional reactions to it. I know Marsha Linehan herself doesn't like the term reparenting. It is a term that's used in schema therapy, so I know that I'm integrating the two. And one of the things that I try to say to people quite a bit is, when you come to the groups that I do and look at the stuff that I do online, because I'm integrating DBT and schema therapy, you are going to see some differences in language, different terms and things like that, because uh, I've found in my experience with working with people that using the term reparenting can lead to a bit of a pushback. It's the only reason that I say that.
Is that because of the relationship they've had with their own parents?
Usually, yeah.
I understand what you're saying. I
Yeah.
get that.
So it's
Um,
more of a I'm looking at there is a part of my personality that has a really black and white rigid perspective, on what it is that it needs to do when there is an emotional experience in my system. So there's a part of me that believes when I'm afraid, I have to get angry and yell at you to get you to listen to me because I feel like you're not understanding my perspective. And it's got this rigid point of view that as soon as that feeling comes in and that story is activated, that this is what I have to do. So looking at that dialectically means recognizing that there is a part of my personality that feels this way, and I want to try to first of all validate it so that it feels like it's heard and understood, so that I can educate it on the impact of what it's doing, as well as how it can do things differently. Okay, so
So
we're
if
going to get
you,
into
sorry,
that
go
obviously
ahead.
as we go through the skills. But just often if we look at it from a parenting perspective, there can be a lot of pushback because, sometimes people will say, well, it leads to a lot of anger because, well, my parents should have done this, or, there's just not a good relationship with parenting internally. So I prefer to look at it from a perspective of educating, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. And I like the switch in language. I didn't even think of the last part of what you were saying, not just about the prior experience that you've had with your parents, or maybe the future one you may hold, because I'm
Yeah,
using this like, you know what, I'm going to talk to my mom about this because she
yeah,
should have been reparenting me to, yeah, I can
yeah,
imagine. Something when you were talking about the education, sorry, got a frog in my throat there. When you're talking about the re-education, the thing I was thinking about takes me to that kind of demanding inference in that if you're not listening to me, you should. Like that as though you should be listening to me, right? Not that you're not listening to me, but the actual demand in that you should. Is that something I'm trying to work on when it comes to my education, or is it just how I'm going about communicating my demands?
yeah. And I think I want to be careful that we don't get into something that we're going to talk about in a
Okay,
later
okay.
video. So when we're looking at the language, um, you know, yeah, we're going to try to work on the way that that language is kicking in, particularly if it's coming from a an internal critic. But first things first, we need to be able to recognize the language when it's there.
Appreciate it.
We need to be able to understand that we're having a reaction to something that's happening in our system. And usually this starts with hindsight awareness, right? So, after the fact, there's something that's happened and I've had a behavioral reaction to it that makes me go, oh, crap. Or, maybe I'm trapped in a space that's filled with anger and resentment for a few days. But, after the fact for me, before my ability to use the skills of DBT, I'd get really pissed off, particularly early in recovery. When I sobered up, the early part of my recovery was filled with anger and resentment and frustration and irritation with the people that were around me, like constantly, constantly trying to get them to change what they were doing because I didn't like the way I was feeling. And I thought, well, if I can get angry and control what you're doing, then that will change the way that I'm feeling, rather than recognizing that, I'm actually in control of what's happening in here. If I can self-analyze, if I can recognize that there is an emotional reaction that's happening in me, and build my ability to look at what am I doing in my day-to-day activities that might be adding to that emotional activity in my system, and how can I start to change the way that I'm viewing these situations. But first of all, I've got to learn how to recognize that that is there. If I can't recognize that that is there, I'm just going to keep reacting and then sitting there after the fact going, oh shit, I did it again. Right. So it starts with building our ability to be able to recognize it. And we're going to talk about that when we get into the mindfulness stuff. But the self-analysis aspect of things revolves around, first of all, what am I doing on a daily basis that is contributing to my mental health? Okay, to my emotional state in my system. So am I walking around with a general kind of sense of apathy in my system and taking that into each and every situation that I'm experiencing? Right. So if I'm walking around and I'm feeling there's a general kind of I don't give a shit about life mentality in my system, I'm going to take that into every single experience that I'm going through. So, maybe I need to recognize that I've got this apathetic outlook on life. Okay. If I can recognize that, then there might be some things that I can do about it. I also want to look at, am I Am I feeling sad? Am I feeling afraid and scared? Am I feeling stressed out by just life in general? Am I carrying this sense of sadness, fear, and stress around with me all the time? If I am, I'm going to be bringing that into every single situation that I go into. Right. So, it's giving us some ideas of where we might want to start looking. Okay. Am I dealing with any kind of physical pain that's causing me problems? So, personally, I injured my back many, many years ago. I have a lot of knee pain that I experience. Like I get headaches. Like there's all sorts of physical pain that I experience. And when I'm not paying attention to that physical pain and doing what it is that I need to do to deal with it, um, it ramps up my emotional sensitivity. So I need to be aware of what's going on with me physically. Okay. So am I in any physical pain? Also, what's going on with my diet? Am I eating okay? Am I eating the right type of food that's going to help me with my emotional state? Am I eating too much? Am I not eating enough? Am I eating junk food? Like it's super, super important. I always notice that when I ramp up my intake of sugar and caffeine, for example, and sometimes I do it knowing that this is going to be the impact. But I always notice that when I ramp up my intake of sugar and caffeine, my mood starts to shift. I get really anxious. It comes into my system. So I'm going to be carrying that with me into every single situation that I go into. So paying attention to our diet, like, am I eating okay? Am I eating enough? Am I eating too much? What kind of food am I putting into my system to help me with my mental health? Okay. What's my general level of anger? One of the biggest things that people really, really struggle with, particularly in the early part of any behavior change, is anger and irritation because it's a coping mechanism for something else that's underneath the surface. Right? Whenever we're walking around with this kind of permanent chip on our shoulder or feeling like I used to call it permapissed because I was just constantly fucking out, constantly angry, dealing with overwhelming senses of frustration and irritation about everybody else was supposed to see the world from my perspective. I'm carrying that into every single situation that I go into. And it's going to impact the way that I'm behaving. So, what's my general level of anger? Next, how am I feeling? How am I feeling connected to other people? Right. So, how is my sense of connection to my community? Or am I dealing with loneliness? If I'm feeling lonely and disconnected from the community, I'm carrying that with me everywhere I'm going. So, you know, do I need to pay attention to my connection to my community? And then the last part is what's my sleep patterns like? How am I feeling, as a result of my sleep patterns? Am I following good sleep hygiene practices? Am I getting a decent night's sleep? Is my sleep impacting the way that I'm feeling emotionally? Right? When we look at it from this perspective, this is called a chain analysis. So when we look at the chain analysis aspect of things, we're starting to really understand what we do on a daily basis that could be influencing the behavioral responses as we go about our day-to-day activities. So if I'm not eating right, if I'm not sleeping well, and if I've got a general sense of irritation in my system and I'm meeting you for a coffee, that's going to come out in my behavioral responses to absolutely everything that we're talking about. I'm going to be irritated with you. I'm going to be frustrated. I'm going to be feeling anxious all the time in the conversation. I'm going to be getting pissed off with you. I'm going to be reacting to the situation based on the way that I'm dealing with things building up to that situation. So having the ability to self-analyze from a chain analysis perspective gives us the opportunity to look at things that we might be doing that are contributing to the way that we're living, that we're responding to our day-to-day activities. I do a chain analysis from this. So there's lots of different ways that you can do a chain analysis. This is just the way that I do it. And I do it with my clients and the way that I recommend people do it when they come to the groups and things like that. I do a chain analysis pretty much every Sunday night. I will sit down and just go through this particular questionnaire and just ask myself the questions regarding each of the situations that I just mentioned there, just to analyze where I'm at, just to reflect on what's happening in my system. Is there something that I need to pay attention to this week? Are there particular things that are happening for me that might be an indication that I'm in a bit of a relapse mode or something like that? Okay. Now, When I identify that there's something that needs to be to be looked at, then I'm going to do something that's called a missing links analysis. So a missing links analysis is basically what's the situation that we're dealing with, and then the next question is, are you aware of it? So here's the situation. Okay, so I'm going to I went out for a coffee with Aaron, and Aaron started asking me questions, and I got annoyed at him, I got angry at him, and I said some things that I regret. Okay. First question in a chain and out in a missing links is: are you aware of the behavioral response that would have made a difference? Are you aware of what it is that you wanted to do? What did you want to do differently? Okay. If you're not, if the answer to that question is no, I don't know what I could have done differently, then we need to take a step back and start, asking questions and exploring different behavioral responses and starting to get into the skills of DBT. So that's why I said to you, when we're looking at the chain analysis and the missing links analysis, sometimes in the beginning, we won't know the skills, but it's developing our ability to recognize that these are the things that we want to look at. If I do know that there is a behavioral response that I want to do differently, right? I could have done this, I could have done that. Can I link that to a particular DBT skill as I go through the program? Because if I link it to a DBT skill, now it becomes an applicable thing that I can do. It becomes an intentional thing that I can do in situations to create the habitual response. Right. So, I had an emotional reaction to you, and we'll talk about these in another video. I had an emotional reaction to you. What I could have done is I could have walked away. Okay, well, that's the stop skill. So we can start to integrate that into our behavioral responses, right? So once I start to know what this particular behavioral response is, then the next question is, were you willing to participate in that behavioral response? So was I willing to walk away? Or was there a part of me that was like, no, I'm staying here and I'm going to prove my point and I'm going to get Aaron to listen to me and I'm going to get him to understand exactly what it is. So there was no willingness for me to participate in the behavioral response that I had. Okay. So let's acknowledge that. Let's work on the fact that, yeah, I know what the skill is that I could use. I know what the effective behavioral response would be. And at the same time, there is a part of me that's saying, I'm not willing to do that. So we start the work with the part that's not willing to do that. Okay. Now, if there was a part of me that was willing to do it, and I know what the skill is, and there's a part of me that was willing to do it, the next thing that we look at is, did the thought of actually doing this, did the thought of me walking away, did the thought of me just saying I'm not engaging with this and walking away come into my mind? Okay. If the answer to that question is no, it never came into my mind. Okay. Why not? Let's start exploring that. Why did the thought not come into my mind? Is it because I'm not practicing these skills? I'm not well versed in them yet? Is it because it's not something that's an automatic response for me yet to think that way? Okay, let's practice that this week. If the answer to that question is yes, then the thought did come into my mind. Then the next question is basically, if you were aware of what was needed and the thought crossed your mind to actually participate in it, what stopped you from doing it? What got in the way? Not from a space of what stopped you from doing it and being judgmental, from a space of curiosity. What got in the way? What was the part of you that kicked in? What was the thought process? What was the reaction that kicked in? And how can we build more and more awareness for this particular emotional response? If we're not willing to do this type of work, and I say this with the utmost respect to every single person, myself included, when I came into this type of work. If we're not willing to do this type of work, we will know the skills. We can have a lot of understanding for what it is that we can do differently, but they won't make a difference. It
Well,
won't
can I just change the language a little on what you said? Because
Yeah.
I think I came in strong with a willingness, but I wasn't capable of
Yeah.
doing
Yeah.
this work yet.
Yeah.
And
Well, that's because you don't have the skill.
I didn't, and I still am working daily
Yeah.
to sustain and retain.
Yeah.
Because it's not something, and correct me if I'm wrong, that it's like, okay, I got it, I'm good now. It's like, no, you got to keep
Right,
practicing
but
every
what you're
day.
missing is what I said was, if you're not willing to do this type of work, if you're not willing to do the self-analysis,
Right.
right? If you're not willing to do the self-analysis, we can't create the capability, because able is, do you have the time to do this work, right? When we go back to able, capable, willing, are you able to do this type of work? Do you have it set up in your schedule? Do you have the time to sit down and practice these things, to go through
Excuse me.
these self-analysis stuff? Right? You know, do you have the space in your schedule to do this type of work? If you're able to do it, okay, are you capable of doing it? Do you have the skills? Well, most of us, when we come into this work, don't have the skill. I would say 99, I'm going to say 100%. We don't have the skills to do this work. Otherwise, we wouldn't be doing it. We wouldn't be coming in looking for support in how to deal with our emotions if we had the skills already in place. So we don't have the capability. Are you willing to do it? Are you willing to sit down and do the self-analysis? Are you willing to look at yourself from a perspective of accountability? Or are you trapped in a space of blame of others? Are you, you know, if you're not willing to look at yourself because the only thing you're willing to do is look at others, you're trapped in a particular way of looking at something. And that's going to be, it's not going to be beneficial for the DBT way of doing things, because it's all about self-analysis and accountability. I need to look at myself, right? Are my behavioral responses effective for me to live the life I want to live, being the person I want to be, in the areas of life that are important to me, according to my true, authentic values and beliefs, right? And if they are, keep doing it. If my behavioral response lines up with who I want to be, living the life I want to live, right? Then why would you change it? But this is why the self-analysis piece is super, super important. Is this an effective behavioral response for me to live the life I want to live? Most of the time, the answer to that question is no. Sometimes the answer is yes, but most of the time, the answer to that question is no. So if the answer to that question is no, then we get curious as to why we keep doing it, not judgmental. We get curious, and we do that through the self-analysis process. Now, here's the thing. The self-analysis process will lead us into the desire to learn the skills, so to create the capability. But there has to be a willingness to do the self-analysis and look at the accountability in order to step into creating the capability. If I'm
Well,
not
as
willing
you're
to if I'm not willing to look at myself, I'm always going to be blaming other people.
I agree. And as you're speaking, I'm thinking of a student to any teacher. A teacher would rather a student who's willing and lacking capabilities than a
Yeah,
student who's got capability and lacking willingness.
yeah, yeah.
So I get what you're saying 100%. Let me ask you this, so Stephen, like with yourself and your own personal journey, you've been doing this, if I'm not mistaken, for about 13 years. The
Round that,
when
yeah.
did you come across DBT? What was your like eureka moment with it? And what was it about DBT that you saw that was different than other things you had come across before
Yeah.
then?
So in my own journey, I came across DBT. So initially, when I first started working in this field, I got a diploma in addiction and community service work, and a lot of certification in counselling and things like that. And I started working in residential treatment. And the residential treatment programs that I was working in, or the first one, was very much a cognitive therapy approach. So cognitive therapy is all about these are my thoughts, and when I think this way, it activates a behavioral response. Okay, it activates an emotion which causes a behavioral response. That's basically what cognitive therapy is all about. And you know, in the moment, and I was working with myself that way as well, because I'd been exposed to cognitive therapists in the early part of my recovery. So all of my work was about cognitive, 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 thought, 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 thought. But what I couldn't understand was, for me, I know that these thoughts aren't helpful. I know that my behavioral response is not effective. It's not. It's, you know, I was labeling it as wrong and bad at that time. I know my behavioral response is wrong, but I can't stop doing it. So in the moment when you're talking to me, when I'm talking to my own therapist, or I'm talking to the guys that I was working with in the residential treatment program, People get it. They're like, yeah, I totally understand. This is the way I was thinking. This was the negative core belief that I had. You know, in 12-step programs, there's like stinking thinking and all this sort of stuff, right? Very kind of judgmental language towards things, right? So, you know, this is bad, this is wrong, and there's a lot of shame that gets activated in that, right? So, um, and that's the way I was doing my early journey. And then when I was working at one of the residential treatment places in Guelph that I was working at, they had a person come in and talk about the skills of DBT. They did a workshop on it, and it was like a eureka moment. It was like this because I wasn't just listening to the workshop from how can I work with my clients. I was listening, so there's the willingness. I was listening to the workshop from the perspective of how can I use this to work with me? Because I was in recovery myself, right? Obviously, I'm working in the field, but I'm still in recovery myself. Even now, you know, I'm a registered psychotherapist and working with clients on a daily basis, but I still consider myself to be in recovery. So, you know, I'm constantly trying to work on myself. And when I'm talking about this stuff with the people in group and in my one-on-one therapy work that I do and counselling and coaching work that I do, um, I'm not just talking about this stuff from a textbook. I'm talking about the stuff that's worked for me in my own life. So when I got introduced to DBT, it was all of a sudden, it was like, oh, I get it. So the judgment that I'm applying to everything, this kind of black and white perspective that I'm looking at things from, is the thing that's keeping me stuck. I have this rigid point of view on how the world is supposed to be that's connected to my emotion, not my thought. There's an emotion that kicks in that activates these thought processes in my system. There's a story that I've got about the way something is supposed to be. And you know, there's an emotion that kicks in when it either lines up with that or doesn't line up with that. And as a result of that emotion, I have a rigid behavioral response. So I can know that this behavioral response isn't helpful for me, it's wrong or it's bad. But if I feel this way every time this gets activated in me, I can't do anything about it. I'm going to automatically respond until I can regulate the emotion. And all of a sudden, it just made perfect sense to me. The emotion in my system is overwhelming me to a point where there are automatic behavioral responses that are happening. And no matter how much I know that this behavioral response isn't helpful for me, until I can deal with the emotion, it's not going to change. You're on mute, Aaron.
Sorry, I had dogs in the background, so I muted for a sec so we didn't get it. But would you say that it's almost like an emotional reflex?
Yeah, it
Like
is. Yeah.
it's,
Yeah.
yeah. So it's almost like, when the doctor taps your leg and
Yeah.
you're boom,
Kind
it
of.
comes,
Yeah. It's like
you know,
there's an emotional reaction in my system. That's why understanding those three aspects of emotion, right? First aspect is that the emotion that I'm experiencing is it will send a signal out to people around me, right? It's sending out a message to the world around me. Second aspect is that it's sending a message to myself that there's something that I need to pay attention to. And the third aspect is that it activates an automatic behavioral response.
I think crying is one that is
Yeah,
relatable
yeah,
because when we cry, it's obviously a broadcast to the world. Something is wrong with me. It's
yeah,
letting me know that something is hurting inside.
yeah.
And yeah, there's a definite automatic behavioral, and it
Well,
does. Go
what you're
ahead.
talking about is the emotion of sadness,
Correct.
right? So, you know, when there is an emotion, when there's something that happens in the environment that activates the emotion of sadness, it it activates behavioral responses in us. So it influences our body language, it influences what we're putting out into the world. So when I'm sad, I might be kind of moping around in my body language. My shoulders are drooped. You know, maybe I'm crying. There's a behavioral response that's coming out in me. Okay, so the sadness is sending a signal internally to me that I've lost something that's important. Right? That's the whole purpose of sadness, is letting me know I've lost something that was important to me, or I'm about to lose something that's important to me, and it's making me sad. My body language is now sending a signal out to the people in the world around me to come to me and say, is everything okay? Are you all right? Is there anything that you need? Right? And now, if I've learned how to deal with sadness in a healthy way, my emotion was validated when I was a child. My behavioral response to those questions is to talk about the thing that I've lost, to get the validation that I'm looking for, to create the emotional connection with the person that's looking to make an emotional connection with me, so that I feel heard and understood. Right? In a healthy adult environment, that's what's supposed to happen when we experience sadness. The issue is that we don't learn that.
This would be how we form what they call attachment styles, isn't
Yeah,
it?
exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, well, you know what? I think we've done enough for today. What do you think? Do you think we've covered
Yeah,
enough
that's good. I
today?
wanted to cover the just the self-analysis, the understanding of emotion, where, why DBT was really important for me in my journey, and why I think it's super important for my clients, and just looking at the self-analysis aspect of things. I think we've covered all of that. And then we'll obviously get into more when we start talking about the individual skills, mindfulness, distress tolerance, emotion regulation, and interpersonal effectiveness in the next 4 videos.
Forgot about interpersonal effectiveness. I have it written down, but I totally forgot about that. But okay, wicked. So we'll stop for now, and I guess I'll see you later today. Okay.